Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 17. Take Him Down. It was a lovely sunny April morning. The birds promised no one would spoil it. Martin was enjoying a lie-in. He sat up in bed and lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and lay back with his arm propping his head up. He closed his eyes. He felt himself drift into that soft in-between land before you actually fall asleep. Just then the doorbell rang. Oh, fuck it, just as I was getting comfy. Martin got up and went over to the window. It was the postman, holding a letter. Martin went down sleepily and opened the door. "Sign here, please, mate. Recorded delivery. From Her Majesty the Queen." The postman tried to be funny by putting on his faux posh voice and doing a little bow. Martin didn't think it was at all funny. He signed the receipt, snatched the letter, and shut the door. He knew what it was. After he'd opened it and read it, Martin's world seemed to cloud over and go very dark. It was his notification for his trial at Crown Court. His hands were shaking slightly. It said he was due at Knightsbridge Crown Court in 10 days' time. He could tell Sarah at the weekend. He'd have to tell Dave and the band. He didn't dare tell his mum or his sister. No point making them suffer unnecessarily. Jesus. He still hoped that by some miracle he might walk out of that court with a suspended sentence. Anything else was just too awful to contemplate. Martin felt like shit. Sarah was still fast asleep next to him on the airbed in her front room. Peter had fed him with whiskey the night before. Peter's girlfriend Jill had just brought in 2 cups of tea. Martin sat up and lit a cigarette. While he smoked and drank his tea, he looked down at Sarah. She looked so peaceful. How could he do this to her? He stood under the shower as long as he could. Maybe the water would wash away his troubles. It washed some of his hangover away. When he came out, Jill had done him a couple of fried eggs. They made him feel slightly nauseous. The coffee helped. He didn't have a suit, but he had a decent jacket. He'd bought some smart trousers. He'd borrowed a tie off Peter. He'd also had his hair cut. At least he wouldn't look like a drug dealer. Peter drove Martin and Sue into town in his Jag. It glided smoothly and almost silently through the morning traffic. Martin watched the free world go by in a daze. They parked on a meter at the back of Harrods. Knightsbridge Crown Court was a grand but foreboding 4-storey red brick building. The fates of murderers, rapists and armed robbers were decided here. Martin's decision to elect for a trial by jury was a gamble. Martin sat with Sue and Peter in the lobby, waiting for his name to be called. They were early. He held Sarah's hand with one hand and smoked the cigarettes that Peter fed him with the other. He heard his name. He stood up and gave Sarah a long kiss. Neither of them said anything. He gave Peter a hug. Then he went with the usher into the courtroom, where Martin was shown into the dock. He stood there shaking. Everyone stood up as the judge entered. He bade them sit down. After the case had been announced, the jury was sworn in. The judge made his preamble, then the counsel for the prosecution stood up and presented his case. He called one of the detectives who had been present and the uniformed bad cop as witnesses. They gave their identical accounts of events, which included fabricated quotes from Martin. Martin's barrister stood up and presented his case, such as it was. He'd only had a 10-minute meeting with Martin after the initial pre-trial hearing. He obviously had no experience of drug cases. His salient point was Martin's previous good character and family background. Also, the total absence of any evidence to support his intention to supply the LSD. He called the detective, the bad cop, and the good cop as witnesses. He got the detective to admit that the police had found no substantial evidence against Martin regarding the supply of a controlled drug. The uniformed officers admitted that their alleged quotes from the accused were not the kind of thing an educated young man would have said. He also pointed out to the court that the two uniformed officers' accounts of events were remarkably similar, if not identical, down to small details. This indicated their notes may in part have been edited or even concocted after the event. Martin was called into the witness box to be cross-examined. He withstood the barrage of questions and insinuations from the prosecution surprisingly well. He could not deny that someone found in possession of 50 tablets of LSD in the West End would be bound to be under suspicion. He agreed it was a very large quantity for one person's own consumption. His own barrister got him to tell the court how he came from a respectable family and had been to good schools. He'd attended university, albeit unsuccessfully. He had at no time intended to supply a controlled drug to another person. In his summing up, the judge told Martin he regretted seeing a young man like him before a court of law, especially faced with such serious charges. He asked the jury to take his background and previous good character into consideration. Although he had admitted possession of all three drugs, perhaps they could find it in themselves to give him the benefit of the doubt regarding his intent to supply LSD. He reprimanded the uniformed police officers for not having compiled their notes according to regulations. He asked the jury to draw their own conclusions as to the quality of their evidence. The court stood and the jury retired to consider its verdict. They came back after just 10 minutes. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honour. On the charge of possession of 50 tablets of LSD with intent to supply, how did you find the defendant? Guilty or not guilty? Guilty, Your Honour. Martin trembled, shocked but not surprised. Martin Dalgleish, you have pleaded guilty to possession of cannabis and amphetamine sulfate, both Class B drugs. You have now also been found guilty of possession of LSD, a Class A drug, with intent to supply. This last offence in particular is extremely serious. Are you aware of that fact? Yes, Your Honour. Martin stuttered, hardly able to speak. Counsel for the defence, do you have anything to say in mitigation? No, Your Honour. Mr. Dalgleish, do you wish to say anything before I pass sentence? Martin was crying. He had no idea what he could say to mitigate the verdict. I'm just really sorry, Your Honour. I never meant anyone any harm. Mr. Dalgleish, you are an educated young man of good character, from a good family, who has strayed from the straight and narrow through your own foolishness. We have nothing before us that shows without doubt that you are any kind of drug dealer, other than the quantity of drugs in your possession. The police also acted unethically during their investigation by falsifying notebook entries. In view of all this, I feel it is only right to give you the minimum custodial sentence within my power. In the absence of any previous conviction, I would normally suspend this sentence. Unfortunately, as you are in breach of your conditional discharge, I will have to send you to prison for 6 months. With good behaviour, you will serve 4 months. Take him down." The prison officer handcuffed Martin and took him down to the cells. Martin was sobbing uncontrollably now. The officer led him into the cell and sat him down on the bench. From the bench opposite, a man about 10 years older than Martin offered his version of consolation. "Come on, mate, you'll be all right. Keep your head down, do your bird, you'll be out in no time. What'd you get anyway?" 6 months. "Bloody hell, son, piece of cake. Out in 4. They give me 2 years, bastards. My wife will do a biscuit. Here, have one of these, son." He offered Martin a cigarette. He took it gratefully and leant forward to get a light. "Thanks, mate." "You'll be all right. It ain't that bad inside. Get most things you need. Just the food's bloody awful." Martin didn't really listen. He felt utterly crushed and hopeless. Poor Sarah. He felt so sad she had to suffer too. 4 months. It may as well have been life. He couldn't imagine not being able to go anywhere or see anyone for such a long time. He'd be living cooped up like an animal. All those things you take for granted every day. No beer, no joints, no music, no guitar, no picnics in the park, no fresh air and blue skies. Just a tiny cell, dodgy company and dodgy food. He scrounged another cigarette off his cellmate. At least they let them have tobacco. Probably be a riot if they didn't.